I was wrong about everything I thought I knew about my own family. That is the hardest sentence I have ever had to say out loud, and I have said it many times now to investigators, to a judge, to a courtroom full of strangers, and finally to myself in the quiet of a house that no longer felt like home. I was 63 years old, and I had spent 4 decades building something from nothing, only to discover that the people I had built it for had been planning to take it while I was still breathing. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started, not with the betrayal, but with the grief, because that is what they counted on. They needed me grieving and distracted and soft. And for a while, I was exactly that. My wife passed in March. Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to the end was 11 weeks. 11 weeks is not enough time to say everything you need to say to a person you have loved for 38 years. It is not enough time to prepare. It is not enough time to do anything except hold her hand and try not to fall apart in front of her, because she always hated watching me fall apart. Her name was Carol, and she was the better half of everything we ever did together. We had built Mercer Building Supply together, a regional chain of hardware and building materials stores that started as one small shop in Dayton, Ohio, and grew over the years into 14 locations across the state. Carol handled the books in the early years. I handled the floor. By the time we had employees who could handle both, we were partners in the truest sense of the word. Every decision went through both of us. That was the deal we made in the beginning, and we never broke it. When she died, I broke. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have looked alarming from the outside. I went to the funeral. I accepted the casseroles from neighbors. I returned phone calls and sat through meetings and signed things my lawyer put in front of me. But inside, I was somewhere else entirely. I was going through the motions of being a person while the actual person was still standing at the edge of Carol's grave in the cold March wind, unable to move. My son flew in from Atlanta for the funeral. He brought his wife, and they stayed for 2 weeks. I remember being grateful for that. My son and I had grown distant over the years in the way that fathers and sons sometimes do when the son leaves and builds his own life and the father gets busy and neither of them says anything about it until years have passed. But he was there. His wife was there. They cooked dinner and kept the house from getting too quiet, and I told myself that grief had a way of bringing people back together. I told myself a lot of things that turned out not to be true. My daughter and her husband drove up from Columbus every weekend for those first 2 months. She had always been closer to her mother than to me, the way daughters sometimes are, but she was attentive in that quiet season, checking in, bringing food, sitting with me on the back porch while I pretended to enjoy the spring weather I could not actually feel. It was my office manager who I was not paying enough attention to. Her name is Ruth. She had worked for Mercer Building Supply for 22 years. She started as a part-time bookkeeper when we had 4 locations, and by the time Carol got sick, she was running the day-to-day financial operations of all 14 stores. She knew our business better than I did. She knew our accounts, our vendors, our margins, and she had been loyal to Carol and me in a way that some employees never are, not because we demanded it, but because Ruth was simply that kind of person, the kind who notices things, the kind who keeps her head down and does the work, and says nothing unless she is certain. She had been trying to say something for 3 weeks before I finally heard her. Looking back, I can see the signs I missed. She had left 2 voicemails I had returned with short, distracted calls. She had flagged 2 items in the weekly financial summary as requiring your personal review, and I had asked my son to look them over, since he was visiting. She had sent an email with the subject line marked Urgent Confidential that I had opened, skimmed, and told myself I would read properly after the weekend. I did not read it properly after the weekend. The morning everything changed was a Tuesday in late May. My son had flown back to Atlanta, but my daughter and her husband were visiting. We had scheduled a meeting at the Mercer corporate office, a routine review of the first quarter numbers, which my daughter's husband had offered to help analyze since he worked in finance. I remember thinking it was kind of him. I remember thinking my daughter had married a good man. I arrived at the office at 9. Ruth was already at her desk, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the way she looked at me when I walked in. Ruth is not an expressive person. She is measured and precise and has a face that reveals very little under normal circumstances. But that morning, when our eyes met, I saw something in her expression that I did not have a name for yet. It was not quite fear. It was not quite urgency. It was something quieter than both of those things, and more serious. She stood up from her desk. My daughter and her husband were already in the conference room. I could see them through the glass wall, sitting together, a stack of folders on the table between them. My daughter's husband was in his suit. My daughter had a yellow legal pad and a pen. They looked organized. They looked prepared. "Good morning," I said to Ruth, already moving toward the conference room. She stepped into my path, not blocking me, exactly, just close enough that I stopped. "I need 1 minute," she said very quietly. I looked at her. I looked at the conference room. They're already waiting. 1 minute, please." There was something in the word please that I had not heard from Ruth before. She was not a woman who asked for things she did not mean. I stopped. She did not say anything dramatic. She did not hand me a folder or produce evidence or make an accusation. She looked at me directly and said, very quietly, "Do not sign anything today. Whatever they ask you to sign, whatever the reason they give you, tell them you need to have your attorney review it first. Will you do that?" I stared at her. "Ruth, I know how this sounds," she said. "I know you may be angry with me later. That's all right, but please do not sign anything in that room today." I looked at her for a long moment. 22 years. That was the number sitting between us. 22 years of Ruth doing exactly what she said she would do, never once asking me for anything she did not deserve, never once overstepping. And here she was, one step past her usual boundary, asking me for one thing. I nodded. I walked into the conference room. What happened over the next 2 hours was something I have replayed many times since then. Looking for the moment, I should have recognized what was actually occurring. My daughter and her husband presented what they described as a restructuring proposal, a plan to consolidate the Mercer holdings into a single management entity for tax efficiency, they said. Given that I was now managing everything alone, they were concerned about me. That was the framing. They wanted to help carry the burden. The documents were thick, 30, maybe 40 pages. My daughter's husband walked me through a summary, using language that was just technical enough that I would have needed time to parse it. He was good. He moved quickly but not suspiciously quickly, and he paused to answer questions. And he was warm and patient and kept mentioning Carol, kept saying that this was about protecting what she and I had built together. At the end, he slid a signature page across the table. "This just initiates the process," he said. "Nothing is final until the full transfer completes, which takes 60 days. But we need your authorization to begin." I picked up the pen. I thought about Ruth standing in the hallway. I thought about the way she had said please. I set the pen down. "I appreciate everything you've put into this," I said, "but I want my attorney to look it over before I sign anything. Standard practice." Something moved across my daughter's husband's face. It was fast, and he recovered quickly, but I had been in business for 40 years, and I knew what it looked like when someone recalculated. My daughter looked at her hands. "Of course," my daughter's husband said. "Absolutely. That makes total sense." They left within the hour. I sat in the conference room alone for a few minutes. Then I went to Ruth's desk. I want to tell you that I was calm and measured in that moment. I was not. I was shaking slightly, in the way you shake when you have been afraid of something and are only now allowing yourself to feel it. "Tell me everything," I said. Ruth had been building a file for 3 weeks. It started when she noticed an unusual inquiry on one of our business accounts, a preliminary request for account transfer authorization that had come in through our banking portal with my digital credentials. She had flagged it internally, then quietly contacted our bank's fraud department without telling me, partly because she was not certain what she was looking at, and partly, she admitted, because she was not sure I was in a state to hear it clearly. As she dug deeper, what she found was methodical and patient. Someone had been studying the structure of Mercer Building Supply for months, the ownership architecture, the account hierarchies, the transfer authorizations. The documents my daughter's husband had prepared that morning were not a restructuring proposal. They were a full transfer of controlling interest in all 14 Mercer locations to a management LLC that he had incorporated in Delaware 4 months earlier. The 60-day processing period he had mentioned was, according to the language Ruth had read carefully, an irrevocability window. Once I signed, the transfer could not be undone without his consent. Carol had been gone for 11 weeks. He had incorporated that LLC 8 weeks before she died. I will not describe what I felt in that moment in any detail, because some feelings do not belong on the page. What I will say is that grief and rage are not opposite emotions. They can occupy the same space at the same time, and when they do, the combination is very still and very cold and very clear. I called my attorney from Ruth's desk. Then I called a private investigator my attorney recommended, a former forensic accountant who had consulted on financial fraud cases across the Midwest. Then, on his advice, I called the Ohio Attorney General's Economic Crimes Division. What followed was not fast. Financial fraud investigations are not fast. They are methodical and quiet and require documentation. And during the months they took, I went to family dinners and returned phone calls and acted like a man who had simply decided not to sign the paperwork yet. My daughter called regularly. Her husband sent follow-up emails, each one slightly more urgent in tone than the last, each one offering new reasons for why the process needed to begin soon. Tax deadline, regulatory windows, my own health, mentioned carefully and with apparent concern. I read every email. I responded with short, polite delays. Ruth and I worked with the investigators every week. She provided records going back 18 months. The forensic accountant found 3 additional attempts to establish financial control, a life insurance policy that had been quietly amended to redirect the payout through the Delaware LLC, a real estate holding that had been refinanced using a power of attorney document my daughter's husband claimed I had signed at a meeting I had no memory of attending, and a forged signature on a vendor contract that transferred a significant ongoing revenue stream to an entity he controlled. The life insurance amendment bore my signature. I had never signed it. The handwriting expert the AG's office retained confirmed what the digital metadata already suggested. The signature had been created using a high-resolution scan of my actual signature on a different document, composited into the form. My daughter's husband had done this carefully, but he had not known that Ruth kept originals of every document that passed through the Mercer offices, organized by date and category, going back to the day she started. 22 years of Ruth keeping records. 22 years of Ruth doing the job the right way because that was simply how she did things. When the indictment came down in October, it covered 7 counts, including wire fraud, forgery, and attempted financial exploitation of an at-risk adult. The last charge was the one that stopped me when I read it. I had not thought of myself as an at-risk adult. I had thought of myself as a grieving man who had come close to making a terrible mistake. But the law had a name for what had been done to me, and it was useful to have a name for it. My son called me the night the news broke. We talked for a long time. There were silences in that conversation that held more than the words did. He had not been involved, the investigators had been thorough on that point, but he carried something during that call that I recognized as a particular kind of guilt, the kind that comes not from doing the wrong thing, but from not being present enough to see it happening. I understood that guilt. I had felt a version of it myself. My daughter did not call. I do not know what to do with my daughter. That is the honest answer. And I give honest answers now because Carol always said that I did not give enough of them. My daughter was not charged. The investigators found no evidence that she had participated in the planning or the execution of what her husband had done. But she had been in that conference room. She had watched him slide those documents across the table. She had looked at her hands when I set down the pen. What she knew and when she knew it is something I have turned over many times. I have not been able to settle it. I may never settle it. The grief of losing a wife and the grief of losing a daughter are different in kind, and I have found that the second one is quieter and does not announce itself with the same clarity. It just sits there, taking up space. The trial lasted 9 days. My daughter's husband hired an attorney who worked hard and asked difficult questions on cross-examination, and there were moments when I sat in that witness box and had to locate a stillness inside myself that I was not entirely sure I possessed. But the documents Ruth had kept were precise, and the forensic accountant was precise, and the digital metadata did not bend under questioning. The jury deliberated for 1 day and 4 hours, guilty on all 7 counts. He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison and ordered to repay every dollar that had moved through the fraudulent accounts, plus damages. The Delaware LLC was dissolved. The real estate holding was returned. The life insurance policy was corrected. I sold the corporate office building after the trial. Too many rooms with the wrong memories in them now. I kept the 14 stores. I kept the staff. I promoted 2 regional managers who had been with Mercer for over a decade and had earned it a long time before I got around to acknowledging it. And I sat down with Ruth. I had been thinking about this conversation for months. Ruth had given me the kind of loyalty that does not have a line item in a compensation package, the kind that costs a person something personally, that requires them to step out of their safe professional lane and risk the relationship and risk the job and say please when they mean it. She had spent 3 weeks building a file in secret while processing what she knew, and she had done it alone, and she had asked me for 1 minute in a hallway. 1 minute that changed everything. I told her that I was restructuring Mercer's leadership. That was true. I told her that I was creating a new executive position, director of operations, with oversight across all 14 locations and a seat at every strategic decision. That was also true. And I told her that the salary attached to that position was $110,000 a year, with a profit-sharing arrangement that would increase annually, and that if she wanted the job, it was hers without an interview. Ruth looked at me for a moment the way she looked at most things, carefully, without rushing. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know that," I said. "That's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that you already do this job, and I have been letting you do it without the title or the compensation or the authority that goes with it. And I have been doing that for years, and it was wrong." She was quiet for another moment. "All right," she said. "All right, you'll take it?" "All right, I'll take it." We shook hands. Then, because neither of us is particularly demonstrative, we went back to work. There is one more thing I want to say, and it is the reason I am telling this story at all. About a month after the sentencing, I was sitting in the waiting room of my attorney's office when I picked up a newspaper and read a brief item about an elderly man in Cincinnati who had signed over his home to a nephew he trusted, believing it was for tax purposes, and discovered 3 months later that the transfer was final and irrevocable, and that he had no legal recourse. He was 71 years old. He had nowhere to go. I read that item 3 times. Then I called my attorney and asked him what it would take to establish a nonprofit organization specifically designed to provide free legal consultation and financial review services to adults over 60 who were being asked to sign documents transferring assets. Not a hotline, not a pamphlet. An actual organization with actual attorneys and actual forensic accountants who would sit down with a person, review their documents, and tell them plainly what they were looking at. It took 8 months to get it properly established. We called it the Carol Mercer Foundation, because she would have done this years before I did, and she deserves the name on the door. We have served over 200 people in our first year of operation. 43 of those cases involved documents that, had they been signed, would have resulted in significant and likely irreversible financial loss. In 11 cases, we referred the matter to law enforcement. I go into the office 3 days a week. Not because I have to, but because it turns out that this is the work I was supposed to be doing all along, and I simply did not know it yet. Carol knew. She always knew things before I did. I used to find that irritating. I find it comforting now. I still live in Dayton. I still drive the same truck I drove when Carol was alive because it still runs fine, and I do not see a reason to change what works. I have dinner with my son when he comes through Ohio, which is more often than it used to be. We are learning how to talk to each other in the way we should have been talking for years. It is slower than I would like and faster than I expected, and I think that is probably about right. I do not know what my daughter is doing. I hope she is all right. That is as far as I can get on that question on most days, and I have decided to let most days be enough. Ruth came to the Foundation's 1-year event last spring. She sat in the back and did not make a speech, because that is not who she is. But after, when most people had gone, she found me near the door and said something I have been carrying around since. She said, "Carol would have liked this." I told her I thought so too. Then we stood there for a minute in the quiet of the empty room, and I thought about a hallway in a corporate office, and a woman who stepped into my path and said please, and how everything the prosecution, the Foundation, the 200 people we had helped, the 11 cases referred to law enforcement, all of it, had come down to 1 minute and 1 word. If there is something I want you to take from all of this, it is that the people who protect you are not always the ones you expect. Sometimes they are the ones who have been quietly doing the work for 22 years, keeping the records straight, noticing the things you missed, waiting for the moment when you are ready to hear what they have been trying to tell you. Pay attention to those people. When they step into your path, stop. When they say, please, listen. You may not get a second chance to.